Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today for the last aerospace webinar of 2017. Today, our speaker, Don McFarland, will be talking about documented information. Don comes to us as a lead auditor for our team here at NSF. I'm sorry, I'm pulling up my documents. And he's been doing a really great job this year of webinar series, and I want to thank him in addition to our customers. Don, I think that your presenter status has been established. If you have any questions or having trouble, I can let me know. But
yes,
I wanted to give some housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded, so I will be sending out a follow-up to everyone with the recorded aerospace webinar as well as a PDF of the slides. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat function. I'll be putting everybody on mute, and we'll be doing questions at the end of it. Let's see here. I'm going to demote you and then re-promote you, Don. I'm sorry about that. And then, what else do I want? And I will be muting all the phones, like I said.
Bear with us for just 1 minute. We're having a technical glitch. But I'll thank Katie for the introduction and welcome everybody to the informational webinar about documented information of the aerospace management system.
So it's enough.
It came up that time. It's in the process of running. The webinar today is going to be about the documented information, as I mentioned. What we'll do is go through, as we have in the past, the requirements that have been prescribed for the transition effort, and then we'll go into the citations from the 9100 series standard, and then we'll go into the thoughts on implementation associated with that. As we all know, we're getting to the end of the year, which is about halfway through the transition benchmark or the transition process, and hopefully you have your audit scheduled. If not, reach out to your account managers and make sure you're getting that done. The only benchmark from the 2017 period that was open the last time we gathered was a report that we had due to A&AB, our accreditation partner, and that's been turned in on time. We're in good standing with them, and it was essentially a risk analysis that was performed by us to address anybody that hasn't been scheduled or hasn't been locked in for a transition plan. So we've got an effort underway to identify auditing resources for all of those clients and work with our account management team to make sure that we've got everything in order. So we've got a project coordinator that's been assigned, Mr. Porter Burnett, and he'll be reaching out to auditors and clients to get all these last stragglers, if you will, through the process. Finally, the system's cooperating with me. Yay. Okay, so catching up on some slides here. The introductory slide, then we have the introductions. There's Mike McRandall, who's also on the phone with us. Mike's the business unit manager for aerospace here at NSF, and I'm the technical manager in aerospace. Mike lives in Florida right now, and I'm out in Utah. As I mentioned, the content today will be the transition plan benchmarks, the documented information citations from the 9100 series, and then some implementation thoughts, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. The transition plan benchmarks, I just covered this first one. This is associated with the 2017 benchmarks. So we'll move right into the 2018 benchmarks. As I mentioned, we are almost there. We've got about 6 months left where we want to get everybody scheduled. NSF has put together a timeline associated with getting everybody at least having an audit completed by June of 18. And the reason for that is the driving force behind that is the September 2018 deadline that's been imposed by the IAF for transition to 9001 2015. As you can see, 9001 2008 and the associated AS standards, meaning AS 9100C, 9110B, and 9120A, are canceled as of the 15th of September, meaning if you're not done with your audit, corrective action is closed, and the CB review process is completed by 14 September, your certificate expires and you get to start over again. We don't want that. You don't want that. It gets pretty costly. So we're striving to get everybody through the process into June and then work through the corrective actions at that point, work through the certificate reviews and all of the administrative activity that needs to occur well in advance of that September deadline, so that we can get everybody through and a new certificate in hand. So with that, we'll move into the documented information citations. And as Katie mentioned, if you have any questions along the way, we're not going to stop, but please feel free to use that chat feature, and then we'll get to the questions towards the end when we get to that point. So I broke this section into a couple different portions. What I want to go through first is the documented information section of the standard. This is section 7.5. So we'll go through the overall requirements for documented information, and then we'll go into individual citations for both the maintained and retained documented information, and then we'll go into some implementation thoughts. So with that in mind, we're going to start in section 751. And as we know, one of the changes that occurred from the ISO 9001-2008 standard to the 9001-2015 standard was the replacing of the term documents and records with documented information. So I had the opportunity to participate on the ISO TC-176, or TAG 176 rather, in the Americas sector, and I'll tell you that was probably one of the most contentious discussions that was held, was associated with, are they documents and records, or is it documented information? Now, at the end of the day, the intent is the same, and it really boils down to the old ISO adage of tell me what you do and have proof that it was done, or say what you do and do what you say. Regardless of what we call it, that's still the intent. The standards vernacular changed a little bit, and the way we control them changed, or was clarified a little bit rather. But the overall intent is to tell us what you're going to do it, and have some proof that it was done. Now, with that said, the requirements associated with true documented procedures or maintained documented information has been significantly reduced. On the ISO side, even more so. We'll get into what you have to have maintained as a documented information for the AS community, but it's significantly reduced from where it was. Does that mean you have to get rid of your procedures? Obviously not, because of this section right here. It says the organization's quality management system shall include the documented information required by this international standard, and documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the quality management system. So you as a company get to determine what you need to do, control, and maintain your processes. Now, if you implement something as a part of executing your process, it is now part of your quality management system. It's part of your documented information. It says the extent of documented information for the QMS can differ from organization to another due to the size of the organization, the type of activities, processes, products, and services, the complexity of processes and their interactions, and the competence of personnel. So there's a lot of things that can be considered as we're determining how complex or how involved our document system needs to be, and how detailed our procedures or our work instructions or our documents need to be. Section 752 is going to talk about creating and updating these documents. So it says, when creating and updating documented information, the organization shall ensure appropriate identification and description. So a title, a date, an author, a reference number. We just have to have identification and a description. So some way to know what it is and what it's for, okay? And that could be one and the same. The identification doesn't necessarily need to be a form number, a document number, a procedure number. The identification and description could be quality manual, and that's it. It could be document procedure or the internal audit procedure. That can be one and the same. You're going to hear later my soliloquy about keeping it simple, and this is one of the clauses I'll refer back to as we're having that conversation. The next item says we need to ensure appropriate controls for format, whether it's language, software version, graphics, and media. So we need to understand how we want to control our documents and the format that we want to release them to, so that we ensure we've got adequate controls in place. Number C, or letter C, says review and approval for suitability and adequacy. Somehow we got to make sure the information is relevant to the purpose for the document and that it's accurate. So we've got some level of review. Now notice the standard doesn't prescribe who has to perform that review. It doesn't say all documents have to go through quality or through executive leadership. There is, I'll say, a precedence that some of the top level documents go through executive level management, namely the quality policy, quality manual type documentation, but it does not prescribe it. Somehow the management team has to be involved in the review, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a part of the formal sign-off process. The note says approval implies authorized persons and approval methods are identified for the relevant types of documented information as determined by the organization. So again, at the end of the day, you get to pick who approves them and how you approve them. As an auditor, I'm going to be looking for evidence that somebody has approved it prior to releasing it and that that person had the authority bestowed upon them to perform that review. And then the controlling information associated with letter A and letter B. 753, in particular 753.1, talks about documented information required by the QMS and by the standard shall be controlled. So we need to have all of those documents, whether we've identified it or the standards identified as being a part of our system, as being controlled. And we do this to ensure it's available and suitable for use where and when it's intended or where it's needed. And it's adequately protected so we don't lose information, whether it's confidential or integrity. We want to make sure that we're all working to the same sheet of music, if you will. So we have a process associated with controlling all of those documents. Notice I didn't say documented procedure or documented information because the standard no longer prescribes a procedure or documented information on how to control our documented information. Just says we have to have methods associated with that. 753.2 says for the control of documented information, the organization shall address the following activities as applicable. And who gets to determine what's applicable? That's you. That's the client organization. But you're going to address the following activities as applicable: the distribution, access, retrieval, and use. Now, if you have documents that are being distributed either internally or externally, you can't say that it's not applicable. I mean, obviously, as applicable is going to be determined by you, but it's going to be based on the activities you perform. So you can't just tell me that those aren't applicable if you're doing that activity. But we need to have methods associated with distribution, access, retrieval, and use. Again, we're working to ensure that everybody involved in the system has access to the latest and greatest. We're all working to the same sheet of music so that we don't have somebody playing Star Wars theme while the rest of us are playing Beethoven. Okay. The letter B item says storage and preservation, including preservation of legibility. Letter C, control of changes, and this could be the version control, as it says, associated with updating and going back for reapproval when changes are needed. Letter D talks about retention and disposition, which is more on the retaining documented information, because we're going to have to keep those on file to prove outcomes, right? And then dispositioning those, and that could definitely be tied to both the quote-unquote documents and records, because when we're done with a documented procedure or maintained documented information, we either keep it and mark it as obsolete, or we destroy it, or we shred it, or whatever it might be. Either way, we want to control those so that we don't have the wrong people getting those documents. Letter E says prevention of the unintended use of obsolete documented information by removal or by application of suitable identification or controls if kept for any purpose. Again, no changes here. That's something that's always been in the standard. Just kind of expanded on the relationship associated with both maintained and retained documented information. The next sentence says documented information of external origin determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the QMS shall be identified as appropriate and be controlled. We're going to talk more about this later, but the documents of external origin can be many things. It could be equipment manuals associated with the items you're using, because they may prescribe the PM maintenance cycles or the capability of equipment or something to that effect. It could be the AMS or the ANSI or the AS standards associated with what you're doing. This could be customer-provided prints, drawings, statements of work, etc., associated with the tasks that you're performing as well. It doesn't say that we have to put these into our format. It doesn't say that I have to copy my header or my footer associated with it and list it on my document master file. It just says that we have to identify them and control them, whether it be putting them on the same shelf or a controlled repository that's identified for each type of document within some matrix somewhere. There are a lot of ways to do this. The intent here, again, is if there's an update to a document that's written by somebody else, we have a mechanism for understanding what's changed and getting that revised document or that updated document into the hands of the folks that need it and that are performing the work impacting quality to our product or service. The next sentence says, documented information retained as evidence of conformity shall be protected from unintended alterations. This is one that's somewhat it's discussed. It can be contentious and as far as what an unintended alteration means. Some people will talk about the use of whiteout or scribbles or overwrites in this section. Although the standard doesn't explicitly say it, customer contract language may, or regulatory language may, describe how you're to make changes to records or to documented information. Now, as we're talking about statements of intent or defined processes, we have a change control process that's also described in the standard. We need to make sure that when we change our processes and the associated documented information, we have folks that have the relevant authority to do so. And that could be in the form of redlining procedures, redlining work instructions, going through an ECO, ECN type process, or modifying prints as applicable. However you choose to do it, you've got to have a method associated with it or a process associated with it, and then we want to show that the outcome matches your intent. The next bold section there says, when documented information is managed electronically, data protection processes shall be defined. For example, protection from loss, authorized or unauthorized changes, unintended alteration, corruption, physical damage. So if we're storing data, whether it be records or documents, to go back to the old nomenclature, we want to make sure that that electronically stored information isn't lost in the event of cyber attacks or in the event of a server meltdown, because we still have a business to run and we still have a contractual requirement to retain that information for a period of time. So we want to have some infrastructure in place to manage that. And as it says, processes shall be defined. Not a documented information item, but we need to have processes defined. In fact, sometimes it can be kind of scary to define this too well in the form of documented information, because that expresses your vulnerabilities. If somebody were to get that, some bad person were to get that, you would definitely be more susceptible to, say, those cyber attacks or retaliation type attacks. And I hate to say it, that's the world we live in. That kind of stuff does happen. So if you have questions on that, we can discuss it later. But really the intent here is we want to make sure we have a process for controlling the servers, the web-based application, the redundancy on the servers, and ensuring that all that data is backed up so that we don't lose data or documented information if something were to happen, malicious or otherwise. So now we'll get into the citations associated with documented information. First, we're going to talk about retained documented information. So as it says here, these are the items formerly known as a record. The evidence of the outcome, good or bad, is going to be detailed in these records. So we have maintained documented information that tells us what to do. This retained documented information is going to either prove that that was done, achieved, executed, or not. The standard doesn't prescribe format, doesn't really care as to how you go about doing it. It could be in the form of a paper document, electronic. It could go to a microfilm if you want, if that's even still a thing. We're using this to prove outcomes. It's kept for a defined period of time, and then it's protected from or safeguarded so that we don't have either security issues or we don't have alteration issues. And then when we do need to make corrections to this, it's typically through that controlled method And the common method associated with medical, military, aerospace is this single strike initial date with the new value next to it. And kind of the background for that, or the reason for that, is we want to make sure we're not trying to hide what mistake was made. Because we don't want it to appear as if we got a non-conforming value and then we altered it to be a conforming value without explaining why or articulating who did that. We don't want to paint the picture that there's any risk or potential risk to the product. So just scribbling over or writing over the top or obliterating it with a whiteout or a correction fluid type item is generally not an accepted practice. What we'd like to see, or what the typical expectation is, a single strike through the incorrect value and then write the correct value along with initial and date next to it. With that said, we'll get into the citations associated with the retained documented information. Now you're going to see a ton of references here. Now my hope is we're not going to go through every single one of these to the extent that it discusses what you have to have as evidence unless somebody has a specific question. My intent was to show you all the citations in the standard that talk to retained or maintained documented information, or in this case both, and then talk about how we control these, because we have a good idea as to what these different requirements are. So as you can see here, it's talking, this is in section 442, retained documented information to have confidence that the processes are being carried out as planned. So this is not necessarily a prescribed record saying we have to have a record associated with that, but we're going to retain any information that's needed to show our process is X. This record or this retained documented information demonstrates that we've done X. We've all heard the adage that if it's not documented, it didn't happen, and this really supports that. If it's something that you guys have prescribed or your customers prescribed as being a required element of your activity, you want to have some proof of the outcome or some proof to show that it was done. 442 is telling us that we want to have retained documented information to have confidence that the processes are being carried out as planned. So with that said, we'll go to the next section here. We'll come back and talk to the maintained documented information citations in just a moment. 7151 talks to the calibration effort and the need to have retained documented information associated with the evidence of fitness for purpose of the monitoring and measurement resources. This is not prescribing like a gauge R&R study, but we want to have some way of demonstrating that what we're using is adequate for the tool that, or the monitoring measurement activity that we're performing. 7152 rather talks to retaining information associated with the calibration effort and specifically the standards or the traceability back to NIST or national equivalent. So we want to have some evidence that they've been evaluated and traceable, and if there's no standard that exists on how to calibrate it or how to verify it, then we'd have information retained associated with what we did to calibrate or verify. Under 7.2, the competence piece, it says we need to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. Now, as we know, competence is not training. Training is a component of competence, but competence is made up of education, skills, experience, and training. So this is saying we've determined that through the job description or otherwise that this person needs this skill set in order to be successful. We have records to show that they've met that skill set, and where there were shortcomings, we've provided some additional training associated with bringing them up to the required competency level. And our retained documented information in this section is going to demonstrate that. Regarding the next one here, it's under 8.1. And you know, there are a couple other places within the standard where it uses the terminology documented information, but it's not necessarily prescribing retained documented information. It's more saying there is documented information associated with some of this. So I skipped over a couple of those citations, but anything that is prescribed as being retained documented information, we're going to talk about here. So this is under the operation planning and control, and this says we're going to control our processes, we're going to define how we're going to do it, and we're going to do this by determining the process, maintaining and retaining the documented information necessary to have confidence that we did what we said we were going to do, and that the product is good as a result. Okay, it also says that the output of the planning activity needs to be suitable for your process, and the documented information specifying the processes of the QMS and the resources applied and all of that other stuff needs to be captured. And that's going to be more maintained versus up here it talks to the retaining of the documented information, mostly to demonstrate the processes were performed as planned and the product is good as a result of it. Okay? The next section, 812, configuration management, and it's talking about ensure the documented information is consistent with the actual attributes. So we want to make sure that we have, again, proof, and we're going to review it at this point to make sure that it's being captured. Not necessarily a specific call out for retained documented information, but it's something we want to make sure we have documented information, again, to demonstrate conformity to the configuration requirements of the product or the service. Under 8232, this is under the contracting piece. The organization shall retain documented information as applicable of the review of the results and any new requirements for products and services. So when we've gone through the review to make sure that we can build it, we can meet the customer's needs, etc., we have documented information retained to that. Whether it's a stamp or signature on the PO or some order acknowledgement type form, it doesn't necessarily prescribe. It just says we need to have some way of ensuring that this has been reviewed. Switching gears to the design piece, you can see a citation here for retained documented information of the inputs of design. There's one associated with the outputs of design and the design and development controls. And under here, it doesn't necessarily prescribe specific records that have to be retained or specific documented information that's to be retained, but it's going to tell us that we need to have documented information on the activities that we prescribed as part of our process. As we know, the standard doesn't tell us what verification, validation, review activities need to occur. It says we need to define that. But we need to have documented information to show that all of the defined activities have been executed and that we're good to go, good to progress to the next stage. Under the outputs, again, there's a required retained documented information associated with the design and development outputs to show that the output has met the inputs. And then we move on to section 8.3.6, which is under design and development changes. So if we're going through a change or an iteration to the design or the configuration of the product, we've got some retained documented information associated with ensuring that the design and development changes have been done, the review has been done, the right people have been involved, and the actions were taken to prevent any adverse impacts. So we've got some evidence to show through maybe an ECO, ECN type process that the design changes were appropriate and authorized by the right and relevant people. Switching gears to the purchasing side of the procurement activity, what they now call external providers, as we know. It says the organization shall determine and apply criteria for the selection or evaluation, selection, and monitoring of performance and reevaluation of external providers. And then we need to have retained documented information of these activities and necessary actions arising. So we have some form of a supplier evaluation record, and if we are approving them for limited status, we would identify the actions arising from the evaluations. And that can be in the form of new status or changes that need to occur to their status, etc. But it's not just a record that the review has been done, it's the review and the necessary actions arising. Okay? Next citation is under section 8411, and specifically it's identifying or flowing down the requirements associated with controlled documented information that is retained by the external providers. Now this can go in the form of the contract language to our supply base, saying you have to retain records for 5, 10, 7 years, whatever it might be, but somehow we need to define how the records are going to be controlled by the suppliers, or the retained documented information is controlled by our suppliers. Now this isn't necessarily a citation for retain, as you can see, but it is important for us because the supplier is retaining, or the external provider is retaining a lot of that information, so it's part of the control aspect of that supplier controlled information that's prescribed in the standard. Under Section 843, this is where it talks about the flow downs, and more specifically says we need to flow to our external providers or communicate to our external providers the requirements for, retain documented information, including retention periods and disposition requirements. Now, although the language up here no longer says where applicable, if you remember back to our clarification webinar and the clarification document provided by the SDR, this is still a where appropriate to the organization statement. So it's not expressed in the standard, but the intent that's been clarified from the authors, from the folks responsible, still says this is a where appropriate or where applicable type statement. So if there is no documented information retained by the suppliers, you wouldn't necessarily need to flow this down. But if there is something that's going to be retained, and I would imagine that's the case in most supplier organizations or external provider organizations, you need to tell them how they're to control their retained documented information, along with a bunch of other stuff. Next citation comes from 851. And 851, as we know, is the production and service provision, talks about controlled conditions for production and service. And it says we need to execute under controlled conditions, and it goes on to further define what those controlled conditions, as applicable, would be. And letter A says the availability of documented information that describes the characteristics of the products, and then number 2 says the results to be achieved. So again, this is defining what we need as evidence. It's not prescribing what evidence looks like. It's saying what you as a client organization or a certified company determined to be necessary to show that output meets the input, or what you built defines and describes and adequately demonstrates that you built what you said you were going to do. That's now documented information, and as we know, all documented information needs to be controlled. There's some other, within the notes here it describes some examples of what those might be, and that it talks more to the maintain piece on this side, documented information for activities to be performed and the results to be achieved. And then the verification, or excuse me, the output of that is the results to be achieved. So it's going to describe what was done or what activities were performed. Letter C of that same section describes the implementation, monitoring, and measurement activities at appropriate stages to verify the criteria for control and processes or outputs, and the acceptance criteria have been met. And it's going to include the retained documented information associated with that, okay? Ensuring the documented information for monitoring and measurement activity for production and service acceptance includes the criteria, where in the sequence, the measurement results to be retained. So it's describing, again, both what we're going to do, criteria and where, and the outputs or the retained information in the measurement results and any specific monitoring equipment required. And that can be both prescribed and, for traceability reasons, we're writing down what caliper, what micrometer, et cetera, what tool was used to capture that. Okay, next section is under 8512. This is the special processes piece, and this is where it's going to talk about retaining information to demonstrate that we've done what we said we were going to do, but it doesn't prescribe what that looks like. It just says requirements for documented information to be retained. So the organization defines what their recipe looks like, if you will, and what proof is needed to show that that recipe has been executed, whether it's the form of a daily validation log, paint, scratch and peel tests, or adhesion testing. It could be operator competency testing, light verifications, et cetera. You're going to define as part of your special process validations what you need to have retained, and then we're going to look for evidence that it's been retained as you've defined in your requirements. Okay? The next citation is 8513 for production process verification. And we have a difference between first piece and first articles. So first piece, as we know, is that production process verification, and then a subset of that is that first article. And this is going to say that regardless of what we're doing, we're going to have some evidence or some retained documented information to show that the results of the production process verification activities have been done, whether it's an FAI form, first piece inspection form, whatever tool we're doing, we're going to have some retained documented information to demonstrate that we've done what we said we were going to do. 852, identification traceability. We're going to have, where appropriate or where applicable, we're going to have some evidence to show that we've done what we said we were going to do, and we're going to identify. Let's see, the organization shall retain right here. Sorry, my mouse was struggling. The organization shall control the unique identifier of the outputs where traceability is a requirement. So there's the where applicable qualifier, and shall retain documented information necessary to ensure traceability. So that can be to the tool, to the operator, to the part numbers, to the lot numbers, to the serial numbers associated with what was put into it or what was used to assemble, test, verify, validate the item. We're going to have evidence to show that it was done the way we said we were going to do it. Next clause is 853, property belonging to external providers. So this is where we have to retain documented information associated with those items that are customer or external provider property. And when we lose, damage, or otherwise find it unsuitable for use, we got to report it and retain documented information, whether it be through a nonconformity report or an NCR log or some other customer communication log. That doesn't necessarily tell us how we're going to do it. Control of changes, we talked about this one a little bit earlier. We've got a process associated with it. Again, we need to have records or retain documented information to show that we did what we said we were going to do. So the results of the review of the changes, the person's authorizing the change, and any necessary actions arising from the review. Okay? Next is, sorry, malfunction with my mouse again. Section 8.6, release of product and services. Again, this is to demonstrate that the product has met the requirements. So we're going to have retained documented information. And then it also tells us that we're going to have all of that required documented information submitted and present at the time of delivery. So we're going to retain documented information describing that we have evidence of conformity with the criteria, traceability as required, and then when it's required to be sent to the customer, we've got to make sure that it's all there. It also says that we need to ensure that retained documented information provides evidence that products and services meet the defined requirements. So it expands on what's stated here in the ISO requirement and says it's got to demonstrate that X is X and Y is Y. And if there's any deviation between the two, we've got to articulate what happened, right? And then we got to submit all that stuff to the customer when it's required. 872 talks about the nonconformity process and anything that's been identified as a nonconforming output, or what we used to dub nonconforming products. So these are the widgets or the service that's been produced. When it's found to be different than what the criteria says, we've got a record or a retained documented information that describes what went wrong, what was done, any concessions that were obtained, and who had the authority to approve that. So this could be setup articles or setup loss that was dropped because the program was off, right? We scrapped it, and no concession was needed because the customer doesn't approve that. Maybe it's customer supplied material and we have to tell them about it, so that could be appropriate here. But we also have to identify who authorized it and then they had the authority to make that decision. So this is your nonconformity record or your nonconforming product record, your whatever tool you're using to identify bad stuff and what action was taken from the bad stuff. Next clause is from section 911, and this is that the organization shall determine what needs to be monitored and measured, how we're going to do it, when it's to be done, when the results of the monitoring and measurement are analyzed and evaluated, and then we need to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of that. So we've got a ton of data coming in from all these different retained documented information sources. The standard says we need to define what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and then we have some proof that it was done in this retained documented information. Okay? Next clause, 922, this is for the internal audit program. No surprise, there's some required retained documented information associated with the evidence of implementation of the audit program and the results. So we have to define our process, our methodology for the audits through the audit program, which includes frequency, methods, responsibilities, etc. And then we have evidence to show that we've done what we said we were going to do. So that requirement's been simplified, as we know, but it's no different. We say what we're going to do, we do it, we have proof that it was done. Okay? Same for management review. Management review, really no changes to the expectation for records. Some of the topics that are to be discussed and the outputs to be discussed are modified to meet the new verbiage and the new requirements. But at the end of the day, we're going to identify, based on all of the inputs, we're going to identify what can we do better, any changes that are needed, what resources, whether people, equipment, environment, infrastructure need to be modified, and any new risks that are identified. And then we're going to retain documented information of all of that stuff, all the discussions, all the inputs, and all the outputs for the management review activity. Okay. Under 1022 for nonconformity and corrective action, it says, no surprise, we got to have retained documented information to show the nature of the nonconformity in the action taken and the results of any corrective actions that are taken. So we have to have documented information to show that it was done the way we said we were going to do. Kind of a common theme there. Switching gears, let's go through the maintain documented information piece. This is statements of intent, provides instructions or detailed of the process. It doesn't necessarily tell us the format, but it does tell us that it's subject to version control for updates. We've got some methodology to review, update, and approve, and then we've got to have some way to identify what versions or what controlling mechanisms exist. So the citations for maintain documented information come from 4.3. Says we need to have the scope of the QMS available and be maintained as documented information. Whether it's in the quality manual or otherwise, we need to have this maintained as documented information. Now keep in mind, the scope of the QMS is not the same as the scope of registration. So what we put on the certificate doesn't necessarily need to match exactly. They should definitely be complementary of each other, but they don't have to be identical or verbatim. Okay, the scope needs to state the types of product and services covered, justification for any requirements determined as not applicable to the scope of the QMS. So we're describing what we do and what we don't do very clearly as the scope of the QMS. Under 442, it prescribes some maintained documented information. And just for clarity's sake, it says this can be the quality manual. It doesn't have to be, but it can be compiled into a quality manual. What we have to have is a description of the interested parties, a description of the scope, the description of the processes, the sequence and interaction of the processes, and the assignment of the responsibility and authority for these processes. So this could be in the form of an org chart, process map, scope statement, or within the quality manual. And then there could be a separate pestle type diagram that talks about the interested parties and their needs. Or you can combine it and compile it all into a single quality manual. Your choice as a company. Under 522, it talks about another source that has to be maintained or another item that has to be maintained. No shock here. The quality policy shall be maintained as documented information. So it's got to be written down, got to be something that has to be captured, associated with our system. And this is a statement of intent from the management team to say, all of our employees, this is what we're working for, this is what we strive for as a company. Under 6.2.1, and I apologize, the header's not corrected there, but under 6.2.1, the quality objectives need to be established as maintained documented information as well. You can see that requirement right here. So we're going to identify what our quality objectives are, what our KPIs are, if you will, our measurable performance indicators for our management system. They need to be communicated, understood, consistent with the policy, be measurable, and we need to maintain them as documented information so that everybody knows what those quality objectives are. Okay, next citation comes from 8.1, and again, this is as determined by the organization. This isn't necessarily something that we can ask for as auditors to say, show me your 8.1 required documented information. This is where you're going to define what maintained documented information is necessary for you to control your processes. Now, if you identify something as being a controlling item or a flow chart or whatever for your process, it's now part of the system and shall be controlled. So that whole for reference only thing doesn't work. But if we determine that we need it, it's going to be under the guise of the 8.1 piece. 871, so there is a required maintain documented information item here. So it says we need to control, or the nonconformity control process shall be maintained as documented information, including defining the responsibility and authority for the review and disposition, taking actions, timely reporting, defining corrective actions. So we're going to have a process or a documented procedure, whatever terminology we want to use. We need documented information maintained to describe what we're going to do when something goes wrong on the product and service side. Okay. In addition, we're going to have some maintained documented information on the corrective action, the nonconformity corrective action side, that describes the information for the nonconformity and corrective action management process. There's going to be, or should be, possibly some linkage or some similarities between them. One's going to be on the product and service. This one may be an input, or excuse me, those may be an input to this piece, but this may include other systemic or more administrative type failures as well. So with that, that's the end of the citations. We're going to get now into the implementation thoughts. Mike, anything to add? I'm going to put you on the spot for just a minute, but anything to add to the citations before we get into the implementation thoughts?
No, I think you covered it all well and good. Nothing whatsoever to add.
Okay, perfect. So let's jump into implementation thoughts here. Again, the overall process for documented information, simplified, is say what you do it, and then have proof that you've done. If you don't have a requirement for a documented information to be, or for documented information to be maintained, and it doesn't add value to your organization, you don't necessarily have to put it into a procedure format or a work instruction format. We're going to talk about reasons to document here in just a moment, but we can certainly accomplish a lot of this through training, through processes, defined processes, and all we're looking for is that retained documented information to demonstrate that we've done what we said we were going to do, okay? If you say it, be sure you do it and have proof of the outcome to demonstrate that it was done correctly. Some food for thought. Keep it simple. You are your own worst enemy when it comes to overcomplicating your document structure, and documentation is a target-rich environment, unfortunately. Auditors don't care to write it up because there's so many opportunities for repeating the same failures given the number of documents that some companies have. Now, is it okay to over-document? Sure, within reason, but keep in mind you still have to pay somebody to maintain that document, you still have to pay somebody to reevaluate that, and you present some challenges if you have some redundancies in those because you may update it on one side and not on the other, and now you've got conflicting documented information because of how much complexity you built into your system. Another point of clarification here, and I mentioned this earlier, the standard does not identify that we have to use document numbers, doesn't identify the use of revision letters, numbers, etc. Don's opinion here is keep it simple. If I have to create a linkage between a document number and a document name, that's another failure or potential failure point where I could fat finger the wrong procedure name tied to the wrong procedure number. Now, it is a silly and ticky-tacky finding, but it's still a finding and something that needs to be corrected, because if you have a linkage to a procedure number alone, you could be grabbing then the wrong procedure that adds no value or doesn't give all the clarifying information. So what I'm saying there is if you don't necessarily need the documented number, the document numbers, and you are still working in a Excel/Word-based or even a Microsoft Windows Explorer folder structure type document control system, perhaps we think about removing what's not essential to your system, simplifying or removing document numbers, form numbers, etc., and just using the naming convention of what the form is. For example, receiving inspection form rather than F1023, so that it just simplifies it a little bit more. Revisions can be in the form of a date, number, or letter. Again, I'm a simplistic kind of guy. I like the date concept because at the end of the day, a number is going to tie back to a date anyways in some way. So if we can keep it simple by just going with a date, and we're using one of those more simplistic systems for controlling it, it's probably not a bad thing. Level of documentation needed, we'll talk more about this in just a minute, but don't overcomplicate it, because you, like I said, are going to paint yourself into a corner by putting things procedurally that don't necessarily matter to your output, your production output, whether it be product or service related. And now, because you've said you were going to do it, I have to audit you to that. Your customer has to audit you to that. And your employees are expected to execute to that. And if we set the precedence that it's okay to deviate from written instruction because it's quote-unquote not correct, that's a dangerous and slippery slope to go down. So we don't want to necessarily do that. We want employees to question everything. If it's stated explicitly in the instruction that you have to do it this way, I want them to do it that way, or better yet, question why they're not doing it that way. Okay? Standard defines the minimum considerations, follow them, and employ what you need associated with your system. So don't overcomplicate it. Again, you're your own worst enemy when it comes to this. Do what's essential for you, but the standard simply says we have to have identification and description. We have to describe or understand the format and the requirements for review and approval for suitability and adequacy. So it doesn't necessarily tell us all of the contents of the procedures. It doesn't tell us how we have to control it. That's all on you. And you get to determine what's appropriate for your business. From a format standpoint, the standard doesn't care. It's driven by competency of the users, the intent of the documentation, the technology limitations or the infrastructure for your company, and any technical data or export limitations you may have. What you have at a large company or a tech-savvy company is going to be different than a paper-based or a skilled trade, kind of an old-school company. And I would expect that. As long as we meet the basic requirements of the standard, which again are controlled documents per the identification description, making sure that we get the latest and greatest to the people that need it, how you do go about this is up to you. Why do I say competency of user? Because that could also describe or dictate the level of detail that we go into within the procedure. If I have very advanced, very skilled labor, whether they be degreed personnel or just skilled labor executing tasks on a machine, I may not want to put step-by-step instruction together on what button to push and what software interface to plug into, because that may change. So we just may say load the program versus push this, plug in here, etc. Again, it's going to be driven by your needs and your company needs and your customer or your stakeholder needs. So good segue here into when to document. Consider the needs of your stakeholders. That could be regulatory requirements, customer requirements, industry norms, management preference, etc. And you got to do what you got to do for those. But beyond that, the question is, who owns the system? Don't write documents for the sake of having them because it costs you money to maintain. If you've just got a document that hasn't been accessed or hasn't been touched in 12 months, perhaps we reevaluate the necessity of that document. Maybe it's for a task that's performed very infrequently, and it's a recipe, if you will, that we want to control so that we have a good understanding of how to do it the next time it comes up. Perfect reason to have a document. But if we just have it for the sake of having it and it's not being used, not being controlled, maybe it's time to clean house and eliminate some of that. And I mentioned this already, but avoid duplication of information when possible, meaning putting, as an example, retention times in a retention records document or a documented information procedure document, if you will, and also in the individual procedures. So if I prescribe in my records retention table that corrective actions need to be retained for 7 years, and then I go to my corrective action procedure and it says retained for 7 years, that can be problematic in that I get a new contract that says retained for 10 years, and I go update my records table, but I don't update my corrective action procedure table or my corrective action procedure. Now I've created conflict. So redundancy can be bad, just something to keep in mind. The next slide talks to controlled versus uncontrolled documented information. And rather than going through all of this again, because we've already talked to it, I'm going to just say the standard says the documented information system includes stuff required by the standard, letter A, and stuff that we determine to be necessary, letter B. Now, both of those are part of the system. And if we go to 753, documented information required by the system shall be controlled. So is there such a thing really as uncontrolled documented information? All you're doing is creating a separate system that's got to be maintained, maintained separately, and you have all of these control mechanisms then that have to be addressed on the uncontrolled and the controlled side. At the end of the day, what matters is people performing work need to be doing it to controlled documents. That's the latest and greatest. That's the information that they need. It doesn't say how we control it, whether it's an electronic format, a printed copy with a watermark on it, or an expiration date associated with a printed copy. But to have things watermarked as uncontrolled is kind of redundant and really creates some opportunities for using uncontrolled documents to execute processes, and could lead to some problems down the line of not having a good mechanism in place to ensure that people are using that latest and greatest controlled copy as they're executing work. Okay, a lot of ways to do that, but it's something that you guys need to consider. Okay, last piece, we talked about already, external docs. Again, the format for the external docs is not required. You don't have to go through your own internal document, or your own procedures as far as adding a template, unless you prescribe that within your procedure. If you say all QMS documents have to have this footer, and you're bringing an external document in, now you've kind of painted yourself into the corner that footer needs to be there. The standard doesn't say that. The standard just says, as you see down here below, documents of external origin need to be identified as appropriate and controlled. So you define what controls are needed, and it could be, again, something as simple as putting all the latest versions on this one shelf for accessibility, and then when I get a new version, I go replace it off that shelf. You have to define what that process looks like. Some companies maintain a register or a log of external documents. That's fine. It's not necessarily prescribed, but it's an option for you. In addition, the examples piece here, it talks to what you need, I want to talk to what is required here, and it's going to be entirely dependent on you. If you prescribe through your work instruction that somebody needs to go review customer controlled document X, that's now a document of external origin. If we say we're going to audit in accordance with AMSQQ something or other, or ANSI standard X, whatever it might be, those are now documents of external origin. If we're going to perform maintenance in accordance with an equipment maintenance manual, that's a document of external origin. So all those things need to be controlled per your methods and per your procedures if you have them, but you're your own worst enemy in that case. Okay? That's all I have here. So this is going to give you an opportunity to type any questions that you have into the box, into the feedback box. While you're putting those in, I'm going to go through the last couple of slides, just talking about good sources of information, and then we'll get into that Q&A period. So if you have those, now is a great opportunity for you to put them into the Q&A box or type of comment in, and then we can go into answering those questions here in a moment. With that said, the information that we get is going to come from the SAE website. A couple sources here. You can get to the Supply Chain Management Handbook, which is a phenomenal tool. I can't tout it enough. If you have any questions on any facet of the aerospace QMS, This is a source of information that cannot be overlooked, and it's free. That's the best part. Another source of information is the standard questions. The standard questions, the support materials, and this deployment support materials link are all going to take you to the same spot. This one is specific to 9100. These two will give you a table associated with the other standards, and you can select 9100 from there. But this is where the FAQs, the clarification document, and all those other tools come from. So feel free to go look through those, peruse them at your leisure, and if you have an insomnia problem, this is probably a great cure for that as well. From the NSF side, we have our transition page. I know we've talked about this ad nauseum, but this is where all the webinars, including this one, will be stored. You can go to our website, nsf.org/info/ISO-updates, and select the AS9100 2016 panel, and the webinar series will be there along with a whole bunch of other stuff. Of those resources, I've got a few listed here. It includes our GAP tool, the transition guide, internal audit tool, webinars, etc. Again, if you have any questions, thoughts, or desires, let us know, and we can probably work with you on creating a tool that might be beneficial. As a placeholder, January's webinar topic, and I forgot to ask Katie if that date was okay, but I'm assuming because she left it in that it's fine. The next webinar is going to be slated for January 24th of 2018, 1 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to talk about organizational knowledge. As we know, this is a new requirement. I think the expectation's always been there, but it's been specifically clarified as to what organizational knowledge needs and is, so that we don't lose out on the critical knowledge. And it's somewhat topical and timely in that we've got a lot of retirements pending, and we want to capture that knowledge before we lose the ground or lose the lessons that have been learned over time. So we're going to review the organizational knowledge section, including why, how, and really what's in it for me as a company. Why should I care about that particular topic? And last but not least, the final slide, and put a little holiday theme to it. A very Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays to everybody. Thanks for participating in the webinar. We're going to go through the questions now, but if you have any questions that you don't want to ask in front of the group, our contact information is listed there. Please feel free to reach out to us. Can't promise that we'll get to your email right away. It's kind of a busy season, but we'll definitely get to it and respond back. So with that, I'm going to just go through the questions that have been entered, and we'll go from there. First question comes from my buddy Pradeep. It says, on the PO or contract review, our initials on the PO or contract being accepted as the review being performed. Now, I'm going to say that this is going to be dependent on the sophistication of your contract review and the depth of the contract review. So the standard only requires that we have a record to show that the review has been performed. But you guys need to determine the depth that has to be executed to ensure that the flow down T's and C's have been met, that the requirements for your procedures, for your screening criteria have been met, that you have the ability to meet the requirements as defined on the contract. This may be a cross-functional thing, bringing engineering resources or other technical bodies involved, procurement organizations, risk management organizations, program management, contracting, etc., depending on the nature of it. In some companies, it's one person looking at it saying, yep, we can do that, fit into the schedule at this time, signed off and approved, and they just initially the order as the evidence of that. So it's really going to depend on the sophistication and the level of detail and scrutiny that you need to go into as an organization. But yeah, how you go about documenting that is really up to you as a company. Next question, for management review, does each input have to be, has to have the 4 outputs mapped, or the 4 outs can be a summary of all the inputs? I really think the intent here, and we did a session on the management review piece last month, but the intent here is to bring together all of this information describing the state of the union, if you will, where we're at as a company. And then from there, management's going to make determinations as to whether or not it's working or not working. And if it's not working, we're going to take actions in the form of changes to the process, changes to the resources, whether they be people, infrastructure, or environment, or changes to product, okay? And then it also now suggests opportunities for improvement and risks, because from each decision, we can now determine that there's future risk associated with going down a particular path, and we want to capture those. But short answer to your question, no, I don't have to identify those 4 characteristics for every topic. The intent is more, we're capturing the discussions associated and any actions arising, including those 4 items, for the discussions that were held surrounding those inputs. Hopefully that makes sense. The next one, 8.1, does the lot traveler or router, is the lot traveler or router acceptable for that? And going back to the requirements of Section 8.1, that's the planning section that says we're going to define what we're going to do, and then we're going to have evidence to show that it was done. If your traveler is geared towards signing off each step, showing pass-fail criteria, as necessary, writing down what tools, equipment, lot numbers, etc., are utilized in each step, that is absolutely acceptable. It's really going to be determined by you, by your client organization, as to what you need to demonstrate conformity to the requirements that have been established. It's not a prescribed level of expectation. It's really, what do you need to ensure that you've executed to the requirements that are set up and to satisfy your customers' requirements at the end of the day. That's the level of detail that we're going to look for. And as long as your traveler has all that detailed, yeah, that's fine. That's really up to you and working with your customers or your stakeholders, your interested parties, to ensure that you've got everything addressed. Okay, next question comes from Joshua. It says, many auditors ask for a master document list. We just use a folder on the server with all the release documents in it. One, do you see holes in this method? Is it actually required? I'd rather not have to manage yet another document for managing my documents. Joshua, I love your comment. The answer is no, you do not have to have a document master list. Unless your procedure says we will have a document master list. Again, you can be your own worst enemy in that case. Being brutally honest, the reason we auditors love the document master list is it gives me an idea of what procedures exist within your company that I may be interested in reviewing, so that I have a handle on what you're doing and what your defined methods are. If you want to print a copy of the folder that they're in so I can see the names of the documents, that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's probably better, again, reducing the likelihood of errors or the potential for errors and simplifying the system. Eliminating that document master list is absolutely an option. And if an auditor gives you grief over it and you agree to disagree, we have an appeals process for that. Our auditors are pretty reasonable. If they can't cite a requirement, they will generally call us at the office, and if we get a question like this, we're going to tell them it's not a requirement. And if somebody still insists, whether you're with another CBE or with us, bring us in the loop. That's what we're here for. That's what the appeals process exists for. There are no ramifications for appeals. We're going to look at it independently and objectively and say, hey, we're off base, or hey, you need to do this and this is why. Even if it's not clearly articulated in the nonconformity, here's why it needs to be done. Okay, that's the extent of the questions that I have asked. We'll give everybody 2 or 3 more seconds here to type something if you're interested. Otherwise, we'll say Merry Christmas. Thank you on behalf of NSF for allowing us to partner with you. Thanks for having us and joining us on these webinars, whether it's through the recorded session or through a recording listened to later on. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend and holiday season. Thanks, everybody.